Many of you start to grow houseplants because of an awareness and environmental consciousness, but lots of the products that we use in that process aren't renewable. Perlite, vermiculite, peat moss, peat itself. So what are some alternatives that we can use? In the video I'll show you some of the things that I've done in the past that have worked, and I'll share with you some of the things that I've got feedback from other people and what they've tried. So perlite and vermiculite are both non-renewable resources. The raw materials for them have to be mined and then they're heated. Perlite is absolutely brilliant for keeping roots aerated. Vermiculite is great for holding water. They're both pretty good at both, but vermiculite is better at holding water, perlite is better at keeping roots aerated. Peat moss and peat are both harvested from what are important habitats, so they're best left alone if possible. Now, the idea about this isn't to make you feel bad and to feel that you're responsible for the changing climate. It's just that by sharing these sorts of things, we can collectively help to reduce the impact that we have. Sometimes people use clay beads. I've never really found them that useful. People will sometimes use broken up pots. That's a good alternative to sometimes use. When I occasionally have to scarify a lawn that's full of moss, I've kept that moss because I wanted to experiment whether that would be an alternative to peat moss. Now, I don't know a lot about mosses. I'm not a bryologist of any description. I wouldn't be able to identify very many at all. When I did a quick Google search, the Hypnum and Euryncium species of mosses are the ones that are found in lawns, and the feathery type appearance of their foliage is quite similar to sphagnum mosses, and they hold water really well. So hopefully that property will then carry over and it can be used in the same way that sphagnum mosses are used in houseplant potting soil. I have at times used cocoa coir, which is sometimes called cocoa peat, but there aren't that many coconuts that grow near Birmingham, so obviously those sort of products have to be shipped in. So it'd be better if you could find some local alternatives that are sometimes free, so they have the benefit of being more environmentally friendly and they're cheap. I'd also like to say a massive thank you for everybody who's recently subscribed, hit over 100 subscribers, which in YouTube terms isn't a big deal, but for me that is a massive deal to have 111 now. People who are willing to listen to me ramble on. And I really appreciate every single one of you, so thank you. Here's the first mix, and I've used a little bit of vermiculite. I had this lying around, so I thought I may as well use it anyway and see whether there's any difference in the growth. So I've got some garden compost that I've got mixed with some extra moss added to it. That moss is from raking moss out of lawns. So it's a pretty useful alternative to sphagnum moss if it works. And these are just some worm castings that I've put in for a bit of extra fertility. Whack that in the mixer, give it a swirl, and you're done with your first potting mix. These cuttings I just took by getting a pothos plant. I was given a string of them and I just cut them up so that there's a leaf node and a little bit of stem underneath it, and I just left them in water and changed the water every now and again. And now I'm going to put in some of the cuttings into this mix that I've included vermiculite in. I'm over potting them a little bit, which can cause problems because it can do things like cause root rot if you've got too moist soil all the time. But it's what I've got and it's usually okay as long as you don't overwater them. Also, the plants will send out roots and grow until they've filled the container to some degree before they put on top growth. So it's actually a really useful thing to use sequentially larger pots. So start with a tiny pot. Once it's filled that with its roots, you can then put it into a bigger pot as it's putting on top growth. I was gifted this spider plant by a friend and I gave her some of the pothos cuttings, and it's now, its roots are getting around the bottom of the pot, so I'm just going to put it into a slightly bigger pot. This monstera, you can actually see it's covered in dust because the house seems to be dusty all the time. I've left it for way too long before potting it on. That's about par for the course. Quite like this old terracotta pot. You can just directly pot cuttings into potting mix or into vermiculite, but I actually like to see in a jar. I like to see the roots form. I find that's part of the fun. I still water propagate. One of my favourite ways is with this beautiful yellow pot, because then your cutting actually looks quite attractive from the get-go. This composted wood chip, which is fungally decomposing, I've heard that this can also work. Some of the bits are quite chunky, so it might be good to sift them out a little bit, but perhaps that'll help with the aeration anyway. That's kind of the point. The only difference between this mix and the last mix is that I've substituted the vermiculite with wood chip. Wood chip, as a result of its carbon content, will mean that it can leach nitrogen from your soil, but this wood chip's been composting for a little while, so that shouldn't really be an issue with it. Definitely left this one in there a bit too long, but it should be okay. I've got a few of my houseplants that I've just had in pure garden compost, and this one is one of them. This was a root cutting that I took, and it's done really well. It's completely filled the pot with the roots. You can actually see them coming out of the bottom, so it's happy in its new container and it's growing on healthily. I've also had reports back from other people who just use garden soil and garden compost mixed together, and they have perfectly good results. I can't give you the results across a really broad spectrum of plants because I don't have that many houseplants yet, and that's because I'm doing so much building work and they struggle a bit with all of the dust, so I don't really want to go and spend a load of money on plants that I'm just going to kill because they get completely obliterated with all the dust that's going around the house. I'd love to hear what everybody else has tried, and I think this is a really important opportunity to collectively share what we've done, because it's so useful to have that experimental data and genuine experience from other people, because it's a much faster way of learning these sorts of things. They're not always written about. I think a lot of garden writers are fearful of giving out bad advice, so they give out standard and regurgitated advice a lot of the time. So that's why these internet communities are so brilliant for that, is that we can share genuine experiences. So if you've used any other growing media, like if you've ever tried rice husks, just using grit or gravel that you've got locally, bark, share what we've been doing with growing media and getting to free alternatives that are super local to you. Thanks very much for watching. See you again soon.